That's a tough act to follow. I was going to have my panelists wear T-shirts in olive drab, but refrained. We're talking about the Arctic, which is a personal interest of mine for some time, and all three folks up on the stage know it very well. I'm going to start, and this is with permission of Senator Sullivan, with a different question because of what the Ukrainian president said just now. Notably, he appeared to blame the slowness of the counteroffensive on the slow arrival of Western munitions, weapon systems, and then the time to train up units to operate those systems, thereby giving Russia time to build up its defenses. And I wonder if you think that's a fair criticism.
I do. I absolutely think it's a fair criticism. And I was just at the NATO summit. We had a CODEL of 6 senators, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. But to me, the Biden administration has, particularly on the NATO front, done a good job of keeping unity. I think the overall result of this summit was important for a whole host of reasons. But one of their biggest flaws, and it is a deep flaw, is the weapon systems that the Ukrainians have been requesting. And it's a long list. I can go through it. Patriots, HIMARS, tanks, Javelins, Stingers. Every time they request the need, F-16s, they request the need for them. The administration worries about escalation, self-deterrence in many ways. Congress, in a bipartisan way, Chris Coons was here a minute ago, we press them, we press them, we press them, and 8 or 9 months later, they get the weapon systems. I'll give you one specific example. Last summer, I hosted a bunch of Ukrainian pilots in Washington, D.C. These are these brave pilots. You might remember the beginning of the war, there was a legend of the ghost of Kyiv, right? Well, this was the ghost of Kyiv. It wasn't one pilot, it was a squadron. And it was them. And they were here asking for F-16s. I had to meet with 10 other U.S. senators. We all wrote a letter, bipartisan letter to the Pentagon, and it's essentially taken a year. I was telling Jim I was on Meet the Press on Sunday. Jake Sullivan was before me. 3 months earlier I was on Meet the Press. Jake Sullivan was before me. And the F-16s came up 3 months ago. At that one 3 months ago, he hemmed and hawed, said we're not ready yet, and I said, this is the problem. And let me make a prediction. I bet 3 or 4 months later they're going to say yes. Well, that's what happened. But that's not helpful. So it's a big problem.
Thanks so much for taking that question a little off piece. So to the topic of the Arctic, which is a big one, Vice Admiral Trey Whitworth of the NGA, big picture, is this the location of the next great game, as it were, among the great powers? Before I do, I just want to give you a chance, because I think it's always important, even in a brilliant crowd like this, to tell folks what the NGA is and what it does.
Absolutely. NGA is 15,000 strong. It is an intelligence agency, but it's also a combat support agency. We've got 9,000 people who are dedicated to this mission, which is effectively mastering the visual domain for intelligence. 9,000 are in the Northern Virginia area. We've got 3,500 who are in St. Louis. We have 500 actually are in this state. And then we've got the swing arm of almost 2,000 people who are interspersed at all the combatant commands around the globe, who are actually listening to those commanders and assessing what he or she needs. And so it's a very driven group of people. We're responsible for some of the things that we're talking about during the course of this conversation or a conversation relative to Ukraine. We're responsible especially for navigation and precision. So munitions to go where they're supposed to go, the precision of the GPS system. We establish those standards, and that will be something we'll talk about here when we talk about navigability. So to keep the U.S. standards of precision, that is something that our people take very seriously.
And why the Arctic? And is this where we're going to see China, Russia, and the U.S. and its partners face off in ways that folks wouldn't have expected?
So understanding the world for us means understanding a place where change is happening at a very rapid pace, and this is probably, I think all of us up here would agree, where change is happening the fastest. And so for navigability purposes, this could actually be a very serious source of strategic competition. Our stake in this is to ensure everyone has knowledge and understanding of that domain up there. It's not a very intel-rich domain, and so the observations that we render are going to be the basis of what everybody uses to make decisions and to collaborate with us, with our partners especially.
Esther, this is something you study and write about frequently. Do you agree with that framing? This is a playing field for the great powers with not just economic but national security consequences and danger.
First, good morning to everyone. Thank you for having this session on the Arctic. Indeed, we call it America's fourth coast because just as we have trans-Pacific, transatlantic, and hemispheric strategic interests, we have strategic interests in the Arctic. And indeed, it's actually appropriate that we're talking about this on Friday. Several of the major strategic trends that we are talking about come together in the Arctic. First, indeed, is the impact, in so many ways, of the war in Ukraine. That indeed, because of concerns of two historic neutral countries, have become, or will soon become, members of NATO. Finland, and we soon hope Sweden, will be welcomed into the world's most important alliance, meaning that the Arctic and the High North and other countries, including our colleagues from Canada and others, will be important strategic interests. So first, the impact of the war in Ukraine is felt in the Arctic as well. Secondly, a trend that we see across the globe is great power competition in our global spaces, in the global commons, whether it's oceans, whether it's outer space. And indeed, we see, of course, the United States and the Russian Federation will always have contact. In the Arctic, we share responsibilities for the Bering Straits, as I turn to the Admiral, particularly on that point. But also, we recognize that China is deeply interested, as are other countries, in resources and other aspects in the Arctic. And finally, I will note that underpinning all of this is the huge impact of climate change. This is one of the places where we see the intersection of climate change and national security, so that the Arctic brings together so many of our fundamentally important strategic concerns.
I do think that not just school kids, but adults should all be given a map of the world looking from the top, because whenever I do that, it just makes you reappraise those relationships on a number of fronts. Senator Sullivan, if this is the framing, new, and not even quite new, right, because this has been going on for some number of years. I went on the ICE-X exercises a few years ago on a sub, and already then, that's 5 years ago, the attention was highly focused on not just Russian activity, but Chinese activity up there. Who's winning? I mean, because there are ways that the U.S. falls behind. I mean, Russia has a whole phalanx of bases along its north coast. Russia has icebreakers. We have like two, right? So who's
two,
winning?
and one is broken, right? Well, thanks for doing this panel. And by the way, we know that the Arctic is important, and the great game is happening. And it was preparation for this panel. You may have seen the headline in the Washington Post yesterday: "An Arctic Great Game as Russia and NATO allies face off in the far north." So if the Washington Post said it, we know it's true, right? So that's to all my Washington Post friends who are here. Look, I think that what's happening is an awakening, to your point, and so I was really pleased to see that the Aspen Institute is hosting this panel. I would say that we Alaskans, have known for a long time the strategic interests in the Arctic and its resources. The Arctic is a very rich area for natural resources, oil, gas, critical minerals. I had my team when I was, back in the day when I was the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in Alaska. We did a study on critical minerals. If Alaska were its own country, we would be in the top 10 in the world in numerous critical minerals. So we have enormous opportunities there. Transportation, as the Admiral mentioned. Of course, the environment, strategic location, as Jim just mentioned. Billy Mitchell, the father of the U.S. Air Force, called Alaska the most strategic place in the world. Because if you look at a map, the way you just talked about, you can get to Asia, to Europe, all over the place in a very short amount of time. So it's a strategic crossroads. And then finally, the interests of the people. I won't name names, but when I got to the Senate, the commander of NORTHCOM back then I was pressing him on the Arctic, He was very uninterested, I will tell you. And the one thing he actually mentioned me, and he was going to the reasons why they weren't focused a lot, Northcom, that's 8 years ago, on the Arctic, and he literally said, well, there's no one up there. I was like, damn, Admiral, my constituents are up there, right? And so those are our strategic interests. Now, I love the military. No offense to the Admiral here. I'm a colonel in the Marines myself in the reserves. But the Pentagon has been the last agency in Washington, D.C. to get that we have strategic interests in the Arctic. And it has been a source of enormous frustration. 8 years ago, we had an Armed Services hearing. Secretary of Defense was testifying. He brought out his Arctic strategy. It was 13 pages, 7 of which were pictures. Climate change was mentioned 5 times, and Russia was mentioned once in a footnote. I held it up in the hearing, looked at the Secretary of Defense, and said, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, this is a joke. This is not a serious defense strategy. So, here's the good news. Since that time, we have made enormous progress on a whole host of issues. We're building icebreakers, finally. Like I said, we have 2. One is broken, but at least we're building. Russia, by the way, has 54, many of which are nuclear powered. They're weaponized. We have the Ted Stevens DoD Center for the Study of Arctic Strategy in Alaska. We are building, finally, a deepwater port in Nome. We have a buildup of the military that's going on in Alaska that is very, very significant. So we are making progress on a whole host of areas in the Arctic. But I will tell you, and again, no offense to the Pentagon, every single one of these initiatives has been pushed by the Congress, oftentimes at the reluctance or even opposition of the Pentagon. So we have a long way to go on recognizing the strategic interest in the Arctic. The good news is it's finally starting to happen.
Pause for applause.
Very unusual you get applause for an Arctic issue, so thank you.
Well, you know. Vice Admiral, you're here as part of the IC, but you are still wearing a uniform. Do you agree with that criticism, the senators, that the Pentagon was slow to adjust to challenges there?
I don't think I'm in a position to actually have an opinion on that, because he was, certainly Senator was involved in these discussions much earlier than I was. I know in preparation for this forum, I read some very serious work done by the Secretary and by OSD. I had a conversation with OSD, and just even having a DASD, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Arctic and resilience, global resilience, to me sends a strong message. Also, in terms of my discussions with the Navy and ensuring that I had the right points for this, I got the impression they were taking this very seriously. And if I could just offer,
please.
NGA, for our purposes, both as a combat support agency and as a member of the IC, I would like to tell you we don't need to be prompted. We really want to understand every inch of this earth, but in very real terms, what's happening above 60 North. And so we have just announced, this is new, a digital elevation model that had been very, I would say, difficult to get a hold of in academic circles as that baseline for 3-dimensional information as to what the baseline is for ice, permafrost, even water. And that's going to be made available. We have worked with the National Reconnaissance Office. We have also worked with the National Science Foundation, and we have liberated that data, which had been mired in just a weird contract, now is actually going to be made available to academia writ large and to the world. That was just put out yesterday, and it's effective immediately.
I'm glad you mentioned before, University of Minnesota gets it first, is that right? But it's going to be publicly available?
They're going to post it, so their center will be posting it, we will be posting it as well, and then at that point it becomes the world's academic commons.
Esther, the effects of climate change appear to be accelerating, which I imagine means that the effects on the Arctic will accelerate, less ice, more corridors for shipping, et cetera. Is the U.S. and its partners ramping up quickly enough to adjust to the new pace of change up there?
Indeed, that the activities are moving much more quickly. I will note some things that are already underway in some areas for improvement. First, just to complement the conversation we just had, we should know that there are additional federal assets that are part of the United States presence in the Arctic. One of them is indeed that to say that they are polar security cutters, which are also operated by our colleagues in the Coast Guard, which of course is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So that is one of the places where we have assets for the Arctic. The other, of course, is the Department of State, and that Secretary Blinken, when he was in the Arctic, in the Nordic region recently, of course announced that we'll return our diplomatic presence in Tromsø as well. So again, we have to play with all of the U.S. assets in terms of being involved in the Arctic. I would also note that it is helpful to have the data that you described, that looking at climate change in particular, we want to be able to have some clear measurements, and so that will be a real asset to people who are following this issue in particular as well.
That data works. Whenever I speak to climate change deniers, I say, just ask the Navy, because it's on their website, right? Effects of climate change and how that has impacts on a number of national security challenges, et cetera. Anyway, I don't know if it works, but I try.
And just to say that then there's the question of the debate about what will navigation actually look like? That there's a lot of speculation about the opportunities for reducing the time for cargo moving from Asia to Europe, but there are important considerations, again, that's still going to be extremely treacherous. Again, I turn to the Admiral for this, but to say that even with less ice, which of course is extremely dangerous for the planet, that it's still extremely dangerous. And so that's, we're all getting mailers, at least I am, and my husband will tell you that I'm gathering them, for sailing in the Arctic for cruises. I think we need to be rather sober-minded about sending civilians in that area.
We'll be swimming in the Arctic. Senator Sullivan, for a brief moment, a few months ago, the Arctic was very much in the news when a certain inflatable came across and over the north and over the U.S., and then basically anything that was floating in that space got shot down for about a week. It appears that there was a vulnerability, if you want to call it that, in near space that was exploited. Has the U.S. military, has the U.S. plugged those holes?
No. And it's a great question, because the issue of domain, this is another reason why the Arctic is so important. The issue of domain awareness for any kind of weapon system that's going to be coming to potentially threaten the United States, every single one of those weapon systems, if they're coming to threaten Chicago or Aspen or New York or Miami, they traverse over Alaska. That's just the geography. That's ballistic missiles, that's hypersonics, that's cruise missiles. These are all threats. We have all the missile defense systems for the United States. Pretty much everything is based in the Arctic, or in Alaska. The ground-based missile interceptors, the radar system. We have a brand new long-range discrimination radar site that's the most sophisticated in the world. And so we have been focused on ballistic, kind of the orientation of missiles that do that, but not on hypersonics, not on cruise missile capabilities, and believe it or not on spy balloons. And so that was a wake-up call with regard to domain awareness. And again, when people say, well, we don't need those systems just protecting Alaska, they don't just protect Alaska, they protect the whole country. The NORTHCOM commander, the outgoing NORTHCOM Commander, General Van Herk, I think has been doing a really good job on this. He has been raising the alarm bell on domain awareness in the Arctic, in Alaska, for the whole country. And I think this was a real demonstration of our vulnerabilities.
I believe he spoke here last year on that topic, Van Herk. Question, since you're a satellite guy, at the time there was some question about what additional capability you get from that altitude versus being up in Earth orbit. Is that a space that, obviously you're closer, right? How much of an advantage is it to be observing? What do you gain in terms of communications intercepts, et cetera, at that altitude?
Given the sovereignty issue of being over the United States, which is an advantage we don't want anyone to have, At the same time, if you are closer, certainly from a resolution perspective and from some other forms of collection, there are going to be some advantages there. Where I think that NGA has a role, certainly in domain awareness, is actually in the art of early warning. And so our people are looking at all of the places that could actually launch these things that we care about, so that we actually have a conversation and can do what we're supposed to do to prepare well in advance. And so I will tell you that whether it's for the northern latitudes or it's for INW related to Russia-Ukraine and vertical escalation, I'm really proud of the people who go to work every day and every night making no assumptions about anything.
Is there, with the advent or the return of great power competition, there's an enormous amount of focus on potential flashpoints between the superpowers. Of course, discussion about whether there will be vertical escalation, horizontal escalation from Ukraine, Taiwan. Does the U.S. go to war over that? Esther, is the Arctic a potential space for global power conflict? And could be accidental, right? I mean, a ship runs into another ship, a sub runs into a sub.
Unfortunately, all areas to some extent pose a danger for escalation. And so that's why it's important that we try to have as much information as we can have and channels for communication. That obviously it's with our adversaries that we have to have some channels of communication. I'll just note that amidst many of the changing aspects in the Arctic is one concern about a loss in one of the places where we had a chance to communicate. And that's the Arctic Council, which again does not focus on security issues. It does focus on scientific exchange and environmental issues, but it brought together all 8 members of the Arctic region, all those who have territory above within the Arctic Circle. Whatever the future of that particular body, and we're glad that our allies Norway are now the chairs. Unfortunately, Russia was the chair during the time of their invasion. I want to make sure that we still have those channels for communication and that we have multiple ways of avoiding conflict in the Arctic, because indeed we have economic strategic interests, and we know that Russia, they have 25,000 miles of coastline in the area. They're going to be in the region. Obviously, China is as well, and that is a deep concern.
Sound like you had a thought. Did you want to add?
Well, I with regard to the great power competition that's occurring, some of you may have seen last year, Russia and China conducted a joint naval operation off the coast of Alaska. And it took us a long time to have assets, and they were Coast Guard assets, that could respond. But I'll just make one final point that I think is an important one, Jim, and it goes back to geography and your point about the map. It's not just the Arctic, but the Arctic kind of spills into Indo-PACOM. When you look at the combatant commands in the U.S. military that have oversight or a piece of the Arctic, essentially a piece of Alaska, it is a real kind of smash-up derby. Admiral Aquilino was here a couple days ago. He owns the forces in Alaska. We now have over 100 fifth-generation fighters. We have a new 11th Airborne Division. We have a lot of assets. NORTHCOM obviously owns the ground. EUCOM focuses on the main threat for the Arctic right now, which is Russia, and STRATCOM is very much focused on the missile defense. So you have right there 4 combatant commands that play a critical role in the Arctic. In some ways that's good, and in some ways that's not good, because then you kind of lose the focus. And to me, that the strategic location of our military forces, the forces base, a lot of people don't know this. You'd be amazed how many 4-star admirals and generals don't know this. The forces based in Alaska are closer to Korea, closer to Japan, closer to the Taiwan Strait than our forces based in Hawaii, than forces based in Australia. So there's just a whole orientation that is often missed when it comes to the Arctic, and again, to your point, how strategic it is.
And I will say on the communications point, I was in Taiwan recently, I was in the Baltic prior to that, Eastern Europe, and everyone mentions to me that the channels between the West and Russia and West and China just many of them just aren't there anymore, and both at the diplomatic level, but also at the mill level, which gives great concern about how you diffuse, potential spots for escalation. If someone has the briefest question, I would love to go. I just like to do it every time we do one of these because there are a lot of smart people here. 30 seconds, 30-second answer, just out of respect, and then we could move on to the next panel. Maybe gentleman right here.
Thank you so much. How does Greenland factor into the United States' Arctic strategy?
Who wants to take it?
I'll say two quick things. First, of course, the Greenland ice sheet is extremely important as a whole factor related to climate change. The other is renewed interest in what we used to know from the Cold War of the importance of the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap and thinking about resupply from North America to Europe. Thank you.
Submarines, too.
And I would just add, kind of more broadly, it was already mentioned, but it was mentioned very much in this Washington Post story, the new membership of NATO, with regard to Sweden, with regard to Finland, the northern flank of NATO is a really important strategic area, which is the Arctic, and I think that one of the many miscalculations that Putin did with his barbaric invasion of Ukraine is now his northern flank and our northern flank in the Arctic is much more strengthened. And that is going to be important for us as a country, but for our allies as well.
We don't talk much about intelligence sharing, but in this context we should. So partnerships are key, and when you're talking about GeoInt and geospatial intelligence, that which we observe and that's what we can put into context geospatially, it becomes increasingly easy to have partnerships. Denmark is a great example, given their responsibilities relative to Greenland. And so I will just say that NGA is here to help in this team sport to be a leader, especially with the observables, observing the behaviors, irresponsible or otherwise, and observables relative to the Earth, and putting that message out.
Admiral, fellow, Senator, thanks so much to all of you. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you.